All right, it's a slam summit with Dr. George Musgrave and Dr. Carolyn Cavanaugh Toft. Quote from the episode: I was number 10 in the MTV chart, on Radio 1 with Rihanna, the Arctic Monkeys. I was working with Ed Sheeran, Mike Skinner. I just signed with a subsidiary of Atlantic, and I just sort of fell out of love from doing it. Find out who said it and why. Keep listening.
All right, I swear I'm living in the loudest flat. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are or where you're listening. This is Jack Mangan from Support Life and Music. You may also know me as involved with the Metal Hall of Fame and metalasylum.net. Today we are having a very serious discussion, but no, we'll keep our usual shenanigans up. But there's a lot to talk about here today. Our two guests are really esteemed guests. We're actually a returning guest is Dr. Carolyn Cavanaugh Toft of ASU. Dr. Cavanaugh Toft, thanks so much for joining us again.
A pleasure to be here.
And then straight across the pond, I need to check my notes because I want to make sure I have it right. So Goldsmiths, University of London. Sir, Dr. George Musgrave, thank you so much for joining us today.
No worries. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. So I have my positioning bad in my war room here. So the article is Musicians, the Music Industry and Suicide, Epidemiology, Risk Factors, and Suggested Prevention Techniques. And we actually had your co-author, Dr. Dorian Lamus, on with us not that long ago. So talk to us a little bit about the genesis and the origin of this paper and how it came about. And well, that's a good place to start. That's a lot of questions in one. Talk to us about how the paper came together.
Sure. So I have been researching mental health in the music industry for like 15 years now, more formally really for the previous 10. The beginning 5 years was my PhD, which I didn't really know was about mental health and well-being because it wasn't focused on mental health and well-being. It was actually in an economics research institute. It's technically a PhD in politics, but it was funded by an economics research institute called the Centre for Competition Policy. And they did a lot about how competition in a marketplace can drive beneficial outcomes for consumers, like lowering prices in the energy sector, and lots of mathematical modeling about what competition can do. And when I was doing my master's, which was in PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics, I pitched to them this idea that I wanted to write about competition, but I wanted to write about how competition was psychologically and emotionally experienced and lived by musicians, basically. Really, because I wanted to write about myself, because like at that time I was trying to get signed, like I was a rapper trying to get signed. I really just stayed in university, like so that I could rap. That's really the whole reason I kept staying in uni. I applied to them and like miraculously won a full grant to do that. So I thought, great, I can keep making rap music, which is what I did. I just moved to London and made rap music and kind of ignored the PhD a bit, but just did it as I was going along. And ended up writing a lot about themes of like worry, doubt, fear, frustration, which at the time I didn't explain through the lens of mental health and well-being because I was writing it kind of as economics. Anyway, after I left, then I spent the last 10 years doing mental health and wellbeing research, including a project that in the UK was very impactful called Can Music Make You Sick? That was in 2016 and 2017, and then a book in 2020. And then subsequently did a big research project in Denmark, which was called When Music Speaks, and a lot of other projects as well. Like I've sort of had quite a productive 10 years, I guess. About 2 years ago, I got an email and so suicide sits as like a bit of a kind of elephant in the room discussion in what I write about. And by that, I mean, I'm not a psychologist. I don't have a psychology degree. I'm not a clinician. I don't work medically with people. I have no medical training. I'm not a therapist. I don't have any of that. Like my BA is in political science, my MA is in politics, philosophy, and economics, my PhD is in politics. But I've lived like as a rapper for a long time as well. So when I write about mental health and well-being, there were always these questions which had a kind of level of seriousness beyond which someone like me didn't feel it was appropriate for me to write about, right? Like I wasn't going to go there because that was for people who wore white coats in their bio pictures on their website, right? Like it wasn't for me. And I think that was reasonable, right? Because it's a serious subject, right? It's not something I was going to stray into. So one day out of the blue, I got an email from Dorian Lamis that said, hey, I'm a suicide prevention specialist based in Atlanta, Georgia, and I've been asked by an organization to come and give a talk on suicide prevention, and they're a music charity or a music company of some kind. Um, and that's not the work I do. I don't know about musicians specifically, but when I go into Google Scholar and put musicians, mental health, your name just keeps appearing. So, can you send me the data on it? And I was like, I don't really have any data on it. I don't know what the data is on it. And he was like, oh, well, could you maybe send me some published papers on it? And I was like, there's not really very many. I mean, there's like a few. There was like a big study that Diana Kenny did, and there were things and bits and bobs, but not kind of masses that I knew about personally. And he was like, right, well, shouldn't we write it? I mean, if it's not really there, shouldn't we at least write a more up to date one? So I thought, wow, that sounds great. So I said, look, I'll bring in my expertise on the music industry and musicians' lived experience and mental health and well-being, and you bring in yours from suicide prevention, and we'll overlap in this Venn diagram of knowledge that hopefully we can generate together. So I sketched out the paper. I said, right, you write this section, I'm going to write this section, and just wrote it up basically. Um, and weirdly, like almost at the same time, I was tweeted by somebody called Alexandra Pittman, who is a professor of psychiatry at UCL, who shared with me this ONS, Office for National Statistics data on suicide. She didn't know I was writing a suicide paper. I can't even really remember why she tweeted me, but I remember seeing that and thinking, this is weird. I'm writing a paper with this guy in America on exactly this. Like, this is very unusual. So we wrote the paper over a year, and we tried to make it not just like the problem's terrible, because in a way, like a lot of social science stuff, particularly that I do, I sometimes joke that I can be like the person that says, "Oh, Rome's on fire," and let me like describe the fire to you. It's not my job to put it out. My job is just to tell you that it's on fire. But clinicians, their job is to put it out. So we said, let's make the paper have a two-pronged thing where we outline the problem, but we also talk about what solutions would look like. But that's not my role. So with Dorian, I sort of learnt more, frankly, about the zero suicide framework and what that would look like, and all of his terminology and expertise. And yeah, we spent a year writing it, and then we spent the nightmare of trying to get this published. I mean, it was just crazy. I mean, it took over a year, I think 6 journals. It was like desk rejected from, so it went first to a psychology journal, not empirical, so we don't want it. Then it went to another psychology journal, this is not new empirical study, we don't want it. Then it went to a third one, psychology, this is too arty, we don't want, this is art stuff. Okay, then we went to a music journal. No, this is too medical. And we went to another music journal, and it went out for review. Reviewers came back. They both basically slated it, but said, we're happy for you to revise and resubmit it. We revised and resubmit it, sent it back. They had it for 5 months, and they went, yeah, we still hate it, reject it. And I was like, this is just long. Like, this is just long for me. I was like, we need to try a different angle. I'm going to try a public health journal instead, right? It's like a health one. Um, and then that came back with reviews, but incredibly helpful reviews, and I'd stripped out some of the earlier stuff. And then eventually got published, but it took over a year for us to try and get it published. I mean, it was incredibly difficult. But doing interdisciplinary work like this is always a nightmare to get published, frankly. And then, yes, that's how the paper came. Sorry, yeah, you asked me one question, I'll just talk for 6 hours. But that's how the paper came together. That's how it came out. And then just went mad like when it came out, like in terms of where it reached, and we can talk more about this, but just like the kind of impact that it made was just really striking, right? Like, I mean, you put in musicians suicide, Musgrave or whatever in Google. It sounds terribly narcissistic, but I actually have to check this for my job because they want you to track like where your work ends up. Just went everywhere, like Russia, Kenya, Vietnam, Colombia, America, Canada, Spain, Euronews, The Guardian, everywhere. Just pick this up, and we're obviously like, whoa, this is really intense data because, you know, there's this whole mythologizing around suicide and the 27 Club and this and that. And when it was published, I was like, the data's worse. Like the data is worse than the myth, actually. So that's the story of the paper. Yeah, it was a real ride. It was a crazy ride, actually.
Yeah, no, I'm trusting you answered exactly what I asked you to answer. So yeah, no worries. Yeah, speak as much as you need to about it because that is a hell of a story. Absolutely. Yeah, as I said, I have many questions, but I'll turn it over to. I'm going to call you both by your first names if you don't
Yeah.
mind. We're going to make it informal. So Carolyn, you can go ahead and give us your reaction or your response to your question. Whatever you got.
No, I'm I'm just taken aback. It's one reason why I don't do research is that I hate the publishing experience or the submit and the rejection experience. Um, so so it sounds like it's been this coming together of different loves, right? And um I'm just wondering, like, so you get, so you've published this, you've gotten this great response. Where have you wanted to go since then, or where have you gone since then?
Hmm. Well, the first thing is a number of organizations reached out to me after it came out and said, how helpful this would be for their clinical work and things. And that's like one of the biggest reasons for like doing what I do, like seeing that it feeds through into kind of improving people's lives, if that doesn't sound grandiose, but knowing that it feeds through into that is really wonderful. Where it kind of goes to next, I mean, one of the things that I find really interesting and have found interesting for a really very long time is the relationship between what takes place in music and in particular in certain kind of genres and subcultures and the extent to which they might be a mirror or a reflection of the society. So one of the sections that we have in the paper, for example, which talks about what's happening in Korea in K-pop, and that was not something I frankly knew a huge amount before doing this. That really interests me in learning more about that and to understand the relationship between the society. Musicians are part of a society, to an extent, their behaviors are reflections of that society. So having a richer understanding, a richer kind of anthropological, socio-cultural understanding of the relationships between a musician's psychology and the society they live in is something that I've always been very interested in. And one of the things that came through from this project is I was going to say the uniqueness, so that's not really necessarily the word I mean, but what is taking place in Korea is to me fascinating. It's not a music territory that I knew masses about before. I know I see my students that run BTS WhatsApp groups with 100,000 people in it, but it's not a world I knew masses about. The music industry that I know is a different kind of music industry. But that's something I'm interested in looking at more in the future for sure. Um, but yeah, it's it drives home, like when you talk about it being like overlapping interests, like one of the things that it really does drive home is how, for me personally, like the way that you get really interesting and impactful, insightful research in this field is through working in an interdisciplinary way by bringing in people who like I said, I'm not a clinician, right? But I've just done this project that's looking at like social media and well-being and how people can like stay healthier online. Like to do that, I have to collaborate with clinical psychologists who work on, they work with adolescent well-being. Um, and that's the way that work can be brought alive because there's also sometimes a sense that when it's looked at in this like very narrow, guess what I would call like psyche way, like a psychology way of doing it, it has a language, and public health has a language, and music has a language, and epidemiology has a language. And whilst the publication experience is a nightmare in some ways, it's also like an exercise in facilitating those worlds speaking to each other. And sometimes they're like Wittgenstein's lion, like even if they can speak, they don't understand. But I do find bringing them together in conversation like genuinely interesting.
Yeah, oh, I agree with you. I'm always impressed by the fact that, like, even within psychology, that we all have our own ways of thinking about the world that are right as far as we see them, and and we can be very siloed, and it can be very, very frustrating. And I think there is this need to have more translation of just being able to communicate with, across different areas and seeing and appreciating the different viewpoints, the different lenses that come
Yeah.
in. The fact that you were saying, like, I'm not really part of this. I came from political science and econ. I was like, oh no, econ has a whole lot of psychology in it, as does political science.
Right.
Especially when you get past, some of the factoids and say, wow, let's take a look at what's driving some of these different decisions. So I appreciate the fact that, yeah, you've broached that you and Dorian broached the area of being interdisciplinary, because I think you're right. It's so needed. Um, Yet and I think we're starting to appreciate that view more. At least we are. It sounds like in the public is academia is still trying to play catch up though.
For sure. And like, the publishing landscape in particular. So I mean, I put up a post on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago that like delineated some like journal rejection stories of mine because in quote unquote my world being like sociology of culture, music. I don't really know what discipline I'm in, but like I'll broadly call it like sociology of culture. Like in my world, like I publish like a psychologist because psychologists publish like fast and like a lot. So I do like 5 or 6 a year and like bang, bang, bang. But in sociology and stuff like that's really, really fast. So when I was having conversations with like other academics and stuff recently, I was like, oh yeah, the vast majority of stuff that I submit has been rejected from like 4 places. And they think like, what? But it's because it's so hard to place it. I mean, lots of things. I have a paper currently that's like the most read paper in this journal. It's like 27,000 views in this, which is in academia is massive. That was rejected from like 7 journals, like before it ended up in that journal, because everyone was like, I don't get this. But in the end, I just think like I'm just going to keep going with this. Like I believe it's good. I believe it's important. And where people come back with really the peer review, like it always, in my view, it always makes it better. Like it does in the end always strengthen it and make it better. I always believe that it has. And it certainly has in this paper. Like this paper had a far sketchier zero suicide framework before the peer reviewers came in and kind of forced us to strengthen it. Um, it always makes it better, but the siloing of like how you speak to these different disciplines is slightly nightmarish. And in a way, one of the things that makes it more nightmarish as well is that the higher impact factor the journals, in a way, the more siloed they are.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and particularly, American journals as
Oh yeah,
well.
they're snooty.
You know,
We are snooty.
right? Like,
Yes.
is this done in America or in this particular way, written in this particular way? Because if it's not, we don't want it. Um, yeah, it's a challenge, but the main thing is just yeah, you just keep going and get the work out, and then also then to try and work out how you turn that work then into language that other people can understand and engage with, right? Like to speak to the media about it and to have it shared. And sometimes it ends up being a bit salacious, like yeah, okay, some of the headlines that come out about this one were all a bit, bang bang, but that's the nature of speaking to the media. That's fine. It's ultimately it's helping people to realize that like it's serious. Like it's serious stuff. Like it is really serious, and it's not just oh here's a few wacky people who had different personality. Sure, like maybe personality is part of it. I don't have the kind of psychology of personality understanding to really pick that apart, but it's not trivial. The data is not trivial. It's really serious. Um, so yeah, yeah,
No, and I do appreciate that, and I don't want to. I could take us off in a whole other direction. I want to
sure,
kind
yeah,
of
same.
throw it back to Jack for a second, because but I do appreciate the fact, and I think the importance there of just of being able to communicate and communicating to the different stakeholders, which include the lay public as well as the media, as where kind of the music industry and media, and I think it's just so important. And my hope is that we can get it can get communicated in a way that more of the so-called experts, academics will pick it up and start to participate in providing more empirical research, and more that makes it into that mainstream area as well for
Yeah,
media. But yeah,
yeah,
Jack, I'm going to throw it back to you for a second.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and well, and now I have a million questions based on the
mhm,
everything you just talked about. I really did want to touch on a lot of your publications, George, because I know that this is the one that you and I connected about was this paper, but I know you do have a lot of other publications out and other collaborations. So maybe we can put a pin on that. I do have a follow-up, but yeah, talk to us about your other publication experiences and how, I mean, maybe even how it all fits in the narrative in your narrative of your career and your mission, about the things you're trying to say, and your other publications leading up to this paper that you co-wrote with Dr. Lamus.
yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, the research that I do broadly, the way I kind of describe it is it has these kind of 3 elements to it, that it's interested in the incidence of, the determinants of, and loosely interventions for mental health and well-being among musicians. That's broadly what I do. Now, the interventions section is obviously slightly less what I do because I'm not a clinician, but I work collaboratively with people to kind of unpick this. So pretty much everything that I've done in the last 10 years falls under those 3 umbrellas. Um, as I said, the first project really that was the big one that I did was this one called Can Music Make You Sick with Sally Ann Gross in the UK. And that was, I mean, I saw something that was on the Musicians Union website in the UK recently, and it described that study something like the first time that mental health and well-being in the music industry started being talked about seriously, which I read and was thought, oh wow, that's really cool to hear. Um, but I certainly remember when like when I met Sally, she said, I have a title, and the title is Can Music Make You Sick? And I want to do this project. And at the time, I had just finished my PhD and had taken a job as a secondary school teacher. So I like in the UK, if you teach in like a posh private school, you don't need a teaching qualification. So after my PhD, I thought, oh great, well that's what I'll do because I don't know how to get a lecturing job, so that's what I'll do. I was in the studio one day with this guy who was like producing beats, and he said to, I said, "Oh, I'm starting as a school teacher in September, but I don't really want to do that." And he was like, "Oh, well, what do you want to do?" I was like, "Well, if I'm not going to do music because I can't really make this financially, like I was signed to Sony at the time, but I didn't earn a lot of money doing it. I was like, if I can't do that, then I'd like to be like a professor. Like when I was 5, my mum took me to Cambridge and was like, this is where you'll go when you're older. I think you'll be a good professor because she used to call me a cognitive child. So she was like that. So I always wanted to do that. And he was like, "Oh, my mum works in a uni." I actually have the email still on my phone. He sent it at the beginning of 2015 and it says, "Hey Sally, I'm in the studio with this rapper called George. You should chat. He wants to be a lecturer, Adam." And I contacted him recently. I was like, that email has changed my life. That absolutely changed my life because Sally rang me and was like, "Whatever you're doing in September, drop it. Pull out of that job. I'll get you a job at Westminster. We're going to do this mental health research project." I was like, wow, great, let's do it. Because it was right up my street. It was about competition and abundance and the life of musicians, but framed through health and well-being. I was like, whoa, this sounds great. Randomly as well, I have this other email, like almost like 2 weeks after that, I emailed Goldsmiths and said, "Oh, there's a job at Goldsmiths. I'm not qualified to get it, but can I just pitch myself to you?" And that lady, Sham Prime, emailed me back and was like, "Yeah, you're not going to get this job, but can you come with me for a cup of tea because you sound really interesting?" And then she was like, "I'm going to get you a job." And like she got me a job as well, so I just took them both. So I did, yeah, I did Can Music Make You Sick, which was massive, right? And it led to so much incredible stuff. And but you know, that was about incidents, like it was incidence data on anxiety and depression, self-reported anxiety and depression, because that's just what it was a first go at trying to collect this data, and a very qualitative approach to why musicians felt their anxiety and depression was so high, rooted in a huge number of interviews, some of them lasting, 5 hours long, where we just asked musicians to speak and tell us about their lives. And at that time in 2016, you could feel them being like, wow, someone's asking me. Like someone's really sitting and asking me about not just the good, not like, oh, isn't it great performing on stage? And isn't it great? Like everyone knows the good. You don't need someone else to tell you the good. Tell me the good, but tell me the bad as well, and I will listen. And they were also talking to someone who was living it, right? Like I lived it with them. So when they were telling me about writing 200 songs a year to try and get a cut on an album, I was like, oh yeah, I've been in the studio for the last year doing this and that. They knew that I was speaking their language. And Sally was speaking their language too. She worked in the music industry for 30 years. Um, so a lot of incredible stuff came from this. Like a telephone helpline was launched in the UK called Music Minds Matter, which is now a standalone charity. Um, and then this just like led to a bunch of other kind of spin out publications, some of which came from that data set, some of which just came from my thoughts and reflections around how this research agenda was developing. The kind of next, we then won like a small interdisciplinary research grant to work with a neuroscientist, which was kind of taking some of these findings from Can Music Make You Sick. So this is a paper, it's called Predicting Anxiety and Depression in Professional and Non-Professional Musicians. And that was looking at differences between professionals and non-professionals. But the word professionals is made up. Like from a sociological point of view, I just think it's a made up word. And interestingly, like when we ran the data analysis, the neuroscientist we ran it with, which she was like, it's a null hypothesis because the professionals and the amateurs aren't any different in the well-being outcomes. And I was like, right. And what happens if you ask people, we also asked them, do you see it as your main career? And she was like, oh yeah, they're wildly different. I was like, right, because the word professional is meaningless, right? And we were like, had this whole sociological discussion around why the word professional is meaningless. So we had that project. I won another small grant to do a research project on musicians' social media use and their well-being with some clinicians I've just done at University College London, and then was approached by the Danish, I don't know what you'd call it in America, but in the UK, the Royalty Collection Society is called PRS, the Performing Rights Society. So they collect all the royalties from being played on the radio or whatever, and they distribute it among the musicians. I was approached by the Danish version of that. It's called Coda. And they basically said, like, we're the second happiest country in the world, right? Quote unquote, according to the Gallup World Poll. But we feel like we have like a lot of problems with mental health and well-being in the music industry. We just don't have any data on it. We don't, can you come over and explore, like see what's going on over here? So I went over there in like 20, what year is it now? It's 2025, right? So I went over there in like 2022, and the conversation there was like the conversation in the UK in 2015. So in 2015, when we applied for money for Can Music Make You Sick, one person said, this isn't a proper research agenda. You know, this isn't proper research, right? Because all musicians are mad. So just don't bother. Like, don't bother applying for money. Like, what, like, this is a waste of time. I remember being like, yeah, I just don't believe you. Like, that made me want to win money more. Like, just to be like, I'm going to do this project. When we went over to Denmark in 2022, you could feel from certain people, they're often like older dudes in suits who are a bit like, well-being, this is like young people's nonsense, nah, like. So then we were like, oh, let's find out about the incidents and determinants in Denmark. That was a huge project there. We did the biggest survey that's been done in Scandinavia. We did interviews with a bunch of Danish musicians, and we made a bunch of recommendations about launching peer support groups and interventions. And that's been really incredible in Denmark too. Like, a lot of the Danish music colleges and conservatoires have rewritten their curriculum to include health and well-being because of this project. Peer support groups have been launched. Really amazing stuff. And then more recently, yeah, this suicide paper. So yeah, I'm not even sure what it is. It's like 30 or so papers in the last like several years and stuff that I've been doing this. But the thing is like it sort of became this huge thing for me. Like when I began on Can Music Make You Sick, I kind of thought, oh, this will be my mental health and well-being project, and then I guess I'll have to find another one afterwards. And it was so vast and complicated and interdisciplinary and like frankly interesting that I was like, well, let's do another one. And now it was like, let's do another one, let's do another one, let's do another one. And it just continues to be so fascinating. So that it just happened that the suicide one was just the most recent one of a 10-year run. And it's like now I have a list of all these ones I want to do for like the next 10 years. I was like, there's so much stuff here that we don't yet really know masses about. It's a relatively new topic, and it's also it's a kind of relatively new research topic in non-classical musicians. Because there's lots of it's like I get asked to peer review stuff all the time, like for journals and stuff, and it always says, "Oh, we did this work with musicians, and we did this work with musicians," and you'd get to the end and you were like, "Yes, we did it amongst the so and so symphony orchestra." It's like, yes, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm interested in that too. Like I've done studies with classical musicians too, but I was like, "You mean classical musicians?" Because popular musicians are just lesser somehow. There's classical musicians, which is proper music, and then there's like rap and dance and pop, which is like not. And I've always been like, that's the world I know. The people that I know are all rappers and producers and in bands, and that's the musicians that I know and the world that I know. Um, so there's not masses kind of published and understood about what's going on in this population is a very kind of hands-off word, but you know what I mean in this group. So yeah, and there's been some really cool, like there's a I don't know whether you saw the paper that I wrote maybe 2 years ago. It's called The Dark Side of Optimism, which is a really bleak title. But I love this title. But like, like I was sent photographs from Sonar Festival in Barcelona where there were people on stage at Sonar with the abstract of that in the background. And like musicians were talking about this paper. I was like, it speaks to people, like it just speaks to people. And it's there to speak to people, like to speak to musicians about their life because, and a lot of it is hard as well. A lot of it is very, sometimes like uncomfortable when you end some of these papers where it says like, is this the right career for you? Not is making music right for you, but It's like there's a Einstein quote which I'm sure has been bastardized so that it looks good on a t-shirt, but where he says something like science is great, it's just having to make a living from it that's the problem. It's music, you can change the word science for music in that. It's a bit like that. They're very hard conversations to have with people, but as you see from like the suicide paper, it's important. Like it really is impacting people's lives. And the thing that I always tried to look at was there's a huge desire to always be enthusiastic. You know, when you work in music, everything's brilliant, everything's wonderful. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm so pleased to work for this record label and get paid in cheese sandwiches and paying for my train travel and no salary. And I'm so pleased to be living in this rubbish flat share and desperately trying to get my streams on spot. You know, you always have to be enthusiastic. And it's like in the relationship between music and health, everyone has to be enthusiastic all the time. Everyone has to say how brilliant it is. Everyone has to say its health-giving properties. You know, fine. I'm not saying that's wrong, but if I'm happy to be the depressing guy in the room that says, "Can you just stop for a minute and look at the other side of what's happening here?" Because there is another side, and I'm not saying it's the whole side, or I'm not saying it's something. I'm sure most people don't want to spend every day talking about the depressing stuff that I talk about, but I do think it's an important counterweight to a climate of enthusiasm which permeates both music and the study of kind of art and health more broadly. I think it's an important counterbalance personally. But everyone thinks I'm being moody or depressing, but whatever.
Hi, I'm Coffin Comics cover artist and creator of Carnal Sin of Carnal Confessions, Sourcing. I wanted to take a moment to talk about the organization SLAM, Support Life and Music. As someone who dabbles in music as well as the visual arts, I know that creativity can sometimes be spawned from some dark places and experiences. I just want you to remember this one thing. You are never alone. I hope you'll join me in supporting SLAM, supporting musicians, and supporting their needs. Thank you.
But I think it's such an important thing. I was about to say, I think that's such an important thing
Yeah.
because I think that helps um, it helps to counter that trope. Number one, that musicians are it's the troubled artist, right? They're just like you said, they're crazy. And also it also counters that culture, which is saying, which is really pretty, destructive of like, yeah, let's which romanticizes, the poverty, romanticizes and says, wow, I'm just so excited to be here and get my cheese sandwiches, like to be paid in cheese sandwiches. And because there's this message of like, well, they choose that. They choose that experience. Well, yeah, they choose that lifestyle, so they get what they paid for. And the reality is that, and so I like the fact that when you focus on determinants, you really take the conversation away from this minimizing approach and say, well, no, let's look at really what's going on here and who of this group tends to get more, is more at risk. And you realize that, yeah, like possibly the culture, what aspects of the culture that could be that could be changed. And so I really do appreciate that because I think that is such an important, such an important message.
And it's
Yeah.
trying to also bring together, or I'm increasingly learning how to bring together is probably a more correct way of saying it, kind of robust quantitative explorations of determinants and contextualizing them within sociological ideas that really interest me around dreaming and hoping and ambition and those kinds of things. So I can explain that a little bit more. So there's a study that I did with Catherine Loveday, who's a neuro psychologist, and Sally Gross, where we collected validated mental health and well-being outcomes using this clinical scale called HADS, Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale. And we were looking at the determinants. You know, solo artists are more anxious than those in groups because they're carrying more of a burden themselves. Women have higher rates of anxiety. Women musicians have higher rates of anxiety than men, but they have this in the general population anyway, so it's hard to isolate it. But one of the things we were interested in was this like professional, non-professional split. So we did this thing where we asked people, like, are you a professional? Yes, no, or don't know. Well, the first thing is millions of people say they don't know, right? Because they don't know what this word means. And then we collected objective determinants of professional. So this was what we thought were objective determinants of professional. So this was like being played on the radio, having a manager, having a tour manager, having, the apparatus of the music industry around you. The first thing you see is they don't correlate at all. So lots of people say yes and they have none of those things. Lots of people have all of those things and say no, they don't mirror at all. So we were developing this question, and the wording of the question was, do you see music as your main career? Yes, no, or don't know. And when we were running like the regressions of the relationships, the people that say yes have way worse mental health and well-being than the people that say no. And we were like, it's your perception of it being your career. Because if you work in Starbucks for your salary of $1,500 a month or whatever, I don't know what minimum wage is in America, but whatever, $2,000 a month, and you earn £250 from performing music around and about, do you say you're a musician or do you say you're a barista? Well, lots of them will say they're a musician. They just work in Starbucks to get money, but that's not who they are. So you are, and that's about subjective ideas of identity, who we understand ourselves to be, belief, dreaming. So there we were like, that's a big determinant. So then we tried to replicate that in the study we did in Scandinavia. So that's 1,900 people, and we did the same question, and the result's the same. The people that say yes have worse mental health and well-being outcomes. Now, these are cross-sectional snapshot surveys in time, whatever, and they're always self-selecting because that's the nature in these musician surveys. But nonetheless, it's pointing. I'm not saying nothing's definitive, but I'm saying that it points towards how you see music, your relationship to music, as being very impactful to how it impacts on your health and well-being, along with a bunch of other things like, do you see yourself as successful? Yes, no, or don't know. People that say no have worse mental health and well-being outcomes. So the question is, what does success mean to you? How do you define it? We'd interview people who were like, in Can Music Make You Sick, we interviewed someone who was like currently #1 in like 10 countries in Europe. He just returned from performing at Las Vegas. And I interviewed him and said, so do you feel successful? And he was like, well, I'm like living my dream in a way. Like I'm signed to like one of the 3 majors in the UK. I've just come back from Las Vegas. And he was like, but look where you're interviewing me. This is my childhood bedroom. This is the same bedroom I've been sleeping in since I was 15. I don't have enough money to move out of home. So am I successful? I don't know. Because music is all like a myth. Music is made up. Like I, the other day someone asked me to like recount, I was doing a podcast and someone asked me to like recount my musical story. And I was like, yeah, this one time I was like signed to Sony. They gave me like several tens of thousands of pounds. I performed at like Reading-Leeds Wireless, Radio 1's Big Weekend. I was #10 in the MTV chart. I was daytime places on Radio 1 with Rihanna, the Arctic Monkeys. I was working with Ed Sheeran, Mike Skinner. I just signed a subsidiary of Atlantic. And then I just sort of fell out of love from doing it. And they were like, why? Like, that's like the dream. And I was like, yeah, it's a dream. It doesn't pay me any money. And they were like, what do you mean this doesn't pay you any money? I was like, well, you have to be at an incredibly high level for this to really be paying you something meaningful and sustainable. And I think a lot of people find this like mind blowing, right? But I was like, but I wasn't big. I was not a big rapper. Like you put my stuff in YouTube, you see it has like 100,000 plays, and I was signed to Sony, but I wasn't a big deal. And I certainly wasn't big enough to earn a living that would allow me to have a family. Like, no way. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is to bring together the kind of psychological studying of determinants with a kind of sociological lived understanding of how we like unravel the lives of musicians in a way. Because I think it's not a typical labor market, right? It's just not.
Right.
It's a very unusual labor market, which makes it fascinating, but messy when you're submitting to a psychology journal, right? Frankly.
No, I think, yeah, again, so many great things. What I want to ask about actually, so it's the two different terms, mental health and suicide, both I think are trigger words. Both absolutely often elicit a cringe reaction. Let me talk about support life and music for a minute. As we've been spinning up Slam, a lot of reactions I've gotten have been cringing and people saying, we're not about that, and then some musicians that we've turned them around and still brought them on to talk, and then they really embrace the topic. Again, echoing what you said earlier, they're like, I'm so glad to talk about the job and the stresses. But when you say the word suicide, I've definitely noticed that. So I mean, what I'm turning back to, well, to both of you, but really the question is, what kind of reactions do you get when you say, we're talking about suicide? Do you get people saying that's not what I'm about? I don't want to participate, because I've certainly, that's been a lot of our feedback, has been stay away from the suicide stuff. It's just no one wants to talk about it, and it's true. I mean, I wouldn't go to a party and say, hey guys, lovely party, nice to see everyone. Do you know the suicide numbers? Is anyone feeling suicidal? Like, you don't do that at a party. So that's been my reaction. Now I know. So I want to definitely put that out, as I said to both of you, but your reactions and your thoughts about the trigger, these are trigger words and the reactions that people have to them.
I think it's so in the first one, I also am very interested. Like, I don't have lots of colleagues in America that I talk to about. I mean, I'm assuming both of you are in America, but I don't have lots of colleagues in America about this. But the ones that I do have when I have these conversations are often that this conversation has its own challenges in America. And the reason that one of the reasons I've been reflecting on why that might be the case is, the music industry is an environment that's reliant on external facing positivity and enthusiasm. Well, you imagine what that industry in America looks like. We don't want to hear this negative stuff. We don't want to hear this doubt. Get on with it. Hustle, do your thing, work your way up. If you don't like it, leave. That's a very, I mean, I'm being slightly reductive, but there's a kind of outward facing positivity that's kind of, I don't want to say at the heart of American society, because that's extremely reductive, but you know what I mean, in terms of the American dream and this idea that everybody can make it happen and you can do all of this. And so this sometimes, particularly, was on a panel not that long ago with an American and someone who was like French. And I remember we were having a conversation about this, and the American said, this is a very European conversation. I'm just going to shut the door because my kids are running around. They said this is a very European conversation, working conditions. We don't talk about working conditions in America. If you don't like the work, go and get another job. So I do wonder if there's a particularly interesting challenge in America in having these conversations, because you have to be so enthusiastic all the time in America, right? It's exhausting. So there is that. Now my kids are knocking on the door. Hello.
We were just watching the Bollywood.
How exciting.
Noisy.
Oh, yes, my daughter's now on this podcast. Hello. Can you just give me 2 seconds, love, and then I'm going to come upstairs. Oh, thank you, my darling. So, yeah, I do wonder if there's something like particularly interesting in America about the need to be enthusiastic. That's one thing. I don't know, Carolyn, does that chime with you at all, or is that reductive?
No, I think there's definitely a lot. Yes, there is that theme in America, and in fact, I think there's a myth here, and this has come up actually I had a friend who ran into this with our institutional review board, which was when you ask, the myth is that if we ask people about suicide, that it'll make them, it'll give them thoughts of wanting to die. And and we have to be like, no, the data show that is not the case. But I think it does elicit there's what I hear from a lot of people is it to borrow that triggering word. It is that triggering word of like, you're going to talk about this dangerous thing. And I think enough people have had experiences with loved ones that it touches something that they don't want to talk about, yet it is still something that is very important to talk about. And so, I think you're right. I think it does bring the party down. And yet I think it is something that, we do need to discuss more.
And
But
I've felt this too, right? Like, I know personally how afraid, I guess, I would have been of doing a paper like this 2 years ago. Like, before Dorian's email, I would never have written this. Like, I just would never have done it, because it would have been too far, like beyond my disciplinary expertise, but also a topic of kind of such seriousness that it's somehow reserved for others. But what I've come to learn from writing about it is that if everybody feels like that, then you're not confronting the elephant in the room, which is the
Right.
data that's in this paper and others. Like, this is real and this is serious. And like, I'm I'm unlikely to be the person that leads the confronting, right? It's more like Jack, organizations like yours and organizations that are in the UK that are doing different things. Their job is way harder, right? Because you're like on the front line speaking to people about it. And I think it's, you know, over the last like 10 years, certainly in the UK, I don't know about in the US, but I think like if mental health were and well-being were a person, they've had an incredible PR agent in the UK and Europe, because now it's completely openly spoken about. I mean, I wouldn't say like raising awareness is an issue at all. Like, you ask a 17-year-old about mental health and well-being, they have a higher level of mental health literacy than like a mental health professional 30 years ago did. I mean, they know the language, they know the terminology, they can talk about it themselves. It's become much more acceptable to have this conversation. I think you're going to struggle to do something similar with suicide, because it feels like it's too much for people. I don't know what the answer is for that. It's very hard to normalize a conversation around suicide, I think, because people just find it too much. I get it. I found it too much before I did that. I still find it too much. Like, often through writing this research paper, I had to keep stopping and talking to Dorian, like, how do you do this every day? How can you research this topic every day? And I was invited into a meeting recently with psychiatrists and other clinical professionals to talk about the suicide prevention program, and based on this paper and my like wider expertise. And I left, and they were talking about very serious stuff around, ligatures and all of this, very serious stuff. And I left that meeting, was like, oh my God, like, I need to take a minute, because, and they just talk about it like, yeah, this is what I do. This is my job. I asked Alexandra Pittman at UCL about it. I was like, wow, how do you do this every day? She was like, I love what I do. Like, it's important. I was like, no, I get it. Like, I get why you care about it. But how do you like emotionally deal with doing this every day? This must be so heavy. I guess when it's your work, perhaps people probably think what I do is heavy. How do you write about anxiety and being depressed all the time? Like, that must be heavy. And maybe it's the same with suicide, but it is a heavy topic. There's no way of making it lighthearted, and in a way, nor should you, right?
Right. But of course, so that's the way you approach, and that's kind of what we try to do with these summits. And speaking of these summits, I guess we should probably look towards the door, especially, we have some young children running around, so we'll look towards the door in a moment. But yeah, I think we do try to make it a conversational kind of thing, so that people can relate, and because as you said, it needs to be discussed. As for too many years, I feel like, and this is me just spouting, but I feel like for too many years, the 27 Club is kind of like, I mean, you touched on this. It's almost mythologized. It's almost like cool. Jimi
Yeah,
Hendrix's early death is cool. Janis Joplin, that's cool. That's mystique. It's romanticized. And it's just we're saying, what a tragedy this is. This is so awful that we didn't get that. Not even for us as a world, but for him, for any of those folks, that Janis Joplin didn't get to live a full life. That she didn't get the rest of those decades that she may have had. So that's my feeling on it. But anyway, I will say, can you, both of us, as I said, let's look towards the door a little bit. We can talk about this for hours and hours longer, clearly. But maybe Carolyn and George, thank you so much for being on. Maybe you guys can kind of take us out with a couple of more final thoughts on this. It's a broad topic. A couple more final thoughts, and we'll have to have you both back. So, Carolyn, maybe we'll start with you. If you take out with a final thought or question or anything that you can to take us out.
Well, I guess maybe one thing I was going to ask, I'm going to put George, I want to put you on the spot one last time and ask on a more personal level, what kinds of things, as you've learned about this, what kinds of things are you doing to help your mental health? Because I think that, you're working in music, you're working as a musician, you're working as an academic, you've got a family, you've got a lot of things pulling at you. Kind of, what are some of the things that you do to improve your well-being?
Yeah. It's actually a really difficult question in a way, because I was giving a talk to my undergraduate students at Goldsmiths earlier this year, and we were talking about, I frame it more about health and well-being in the creative industries. They don't all want to work in music, some want to work in film, TV, and there are overlapping challenges that many of them face. And we were talking about, boundaries and work-life balance and this, that, and the other. And I was like, just to let you know, like, I'm like a fraud having this conversation with you because, like, I remember my daughter was like 2, she's 5 now, and when she was 2, I remember she was in the bath. I was sitting next to her while she was in there. And we were having a conversation as you would have with a 2-year-old, and she said something like, "Oh, I like this." She was playing with something. She said, "Oh, I like this," and I was like, "Oh, what do I like?" And she was like, "Eating and working." And I remember thinking, wow, like that's quite a heavy thing for someone that's 2 to say like you like working. Um, because in a way I've just kind of like swapped one obsession, which was like music and trying to get signed on the radio, for like another, which is like publishing and being cited. It's basically the same drug. You've just swapped one for another, really. And trying to make professor before I'm 45, or some other arbitrary made up goal that I have for myself or whatever. Um, so the answer is I don't really know the answer to this. But one of the things that I have found, one of the things that doing this work has helped me to understand a lot, and I think is really been personally very helpful to me, is when we did a study where we were looking at the extent to which the level of success you thought that you had impacted your level of well-being, and seeing that those who don't view themselves as successful struggle with their mental health and well-being, like obviously so. And that forces you to then to have a conversation of like, what is success for you? And I think particularly as you get older, by which I mean you sort of care less about the opinions of others. Like I'm 38 now, like I care much less about the opinions of others than I did when I was 21 or whatever. And what that means is you can then have like a look at yourself without judging yourself, like what are the things that make you happy, right? And like I can yes, I miss doing music a lot in lots of ways, but I can take my kids to Disneyland. I can drive a BMW and an Audi. To me, that's important. Like I can have a flat in central London that has a garden. To me, that is a huge achievement that to other people is not important. I have friends that live in Norfolk, like a rural part of the UK, who would be like, why do you care about whether you live in this postcode of London? But to me, that does matter. Maybe that makes me a shallow status seeking, but I don't care. Like to me, that's important. So I think for me, this constant re-evaluation of like, what is this thing that's making you happy and feel successful? And me and my wife will often sit and have conversations where we go, could we be happier? Are there things that we could do to make our lives better and happier? Some of that conversation comes from this work, from being able to say, have a really honest conversation where you're not judging yourself around what do you think is valuable. And a very small story about this is like a few years ago, when I got signed to Sony, I bought a BMW, like a 4x4, all black BMW, black rims, everything in black. I was like, yeah, cool. I'm doing it. A few years ago, I thought, I can't really afford to pay this anymore, so I'm going to sell this BMW, which I did. And I bought myself like a second-hand piece of junk. And after driving it for like 3 weeks, I was like, when I leave my front door and sit in this car, this isn't good for me. Like I know other people who are like, why do you even need a car at all? I don't want this. I literally sold it the next week, walked into Audi and was like, give me the best Audi that I can afford. Because to me, it makes me feel good. I don't care. Like if other people thought that was stupid, I don't care. And this work has helped me to, I think, have those conversations around for you and your life and your family and your goals and what you want. What is success to you? And can music be a part of that success? Is it in some ways making that success harder? Or could you actually feel a greater sense of success if you pursued music without any money attached to it and just made it part of your life and did other things? Or whatever is right for you. There's not one right answer. It's about being like really honest with yourself about what's right. To me, that's what the work has given me personally. Thank you for that question. No one's ever asked me that question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is wonderful too. I mean, you just seriously that it's such a fractal question because now that leads to 25 more questions. But as I said, I want to be respectful of our time and everything, and say and actually it's a great way to leave it off with people wanting more. But I appreciate both of you coming on and talk. I really hope we can continue this conversation. I hope that we can do this again in the near future. But thank you so much. Everyone should check out the work that you're doing. So George Musgraves and Carolyn, Cavanaugh, Toft, thank you both for being on today. It's been really an incredible conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Lovely to meet you both.
Yes,
Yeah.
lovely to meet you too. Thank you so much, Jack.